Good morning. Thank you very much for coming for this still rainy day. Hopefully, the weather will be better toward the afternoon, and then it will be a sunny day in the afternoon. My name is Hiroki Takeuchi. I'm a director of SANSTA program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. Let me briefly talk about SANSTA program. SANSTA program is the SANSTA program on Japan and East Asia. One thing I say is the sun and star, and the sun represents Japan, and the star represents Texas. And then some people say that the sun and stars program, but the star has to be singular because we are in Texas. And also, this is the only, as long as I know, the only East Asia program in the nation that has Japan before East Asia. So we are SANSTA program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. We are, as I said yesterday, we are so glad to be back to Keio University. We did this conference in 2016, and then later in the 2018, we did the program at the Kansai Gakuin University, and then we were planning to do it in 2020, and then, like as you know, that program was canceled because of the pandemic. So today's program, we start with remarks by my friend and then great scholar or political scientist, Dr. Yuichi Hosoya. Dr. Hosoya is a specialist of European politics, at least originally, and he still talks a lot about the diplomatic history of Europe. At the same time, he talks a lot about every issue of international security and national security. And also, he is one of the few scholars who talks about both political science, history, and actually also public policy. He is a very strong advocate of various policies, especially security legislation in 2015. So I have a tremendous respect on his work and himself. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Yuichi Hosoya.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Takeuchi-san, for your very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Last night, I enjoyed my role as a taxi driver, but this morning I became professor again. I hope you all had a good sleep. I'm Yuichi Hosoya, professor of international politics at Keio University, and also the director of Keio Center for Strategy, which was formally established just 2 months before this year. We are very fortunate to host this event at Keio University, as this marks the first Sun and Star Symposium since the COVID-19 pandemic. Without this kind of in-person exchanges, I always feel that the intimate US-Japan relations can never be maintained. In the sense, at least, I'm very glad that we can really organize this event at Keio University. And I also like to thank Japan Foundation and also Japan Airlines for providing a substantial support to this event. But more than anyone else, I'd like to express my gratitude to Professor Hiroki Takeuchi, the director of Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia, who has spent tremendous time to make this event happen in the last several years, I suppose. Together with Professor Takeuchi, of course, I suppose that many staff within the SMU made a great effort to prepare for this event. We have been in the middle of quite stormy weather since yesterday, but at the same time, we have been also in the middle of very stormy security environment since last year with the Russian invasion to Ukraine. It is true to say that we are now in the middle of post-pandemic uncertain world, as the title here symbolizes. Good news is that the US-Japan alliance today is never so close, never so strong. This closest alliance partnership between the United States and Japan cannot be created without effort of many people across the Pacific, including, of course, Ambassador Toshiba, who made a great effort to the alliance more valuable than before. I always feel that thanks to their effort, we can be proud of the fact that no former enemies became such an intimate and strong friends. Maybe two other rivals are the US-UK alliance and also Franco-German alliance, but they are too good rival to us. Today, we have many attractive panels where leading experts and practitioners will talk on important topics. I'm very much looking forward to learning so many things from those panels. I do hope that all the participants will have a fruitful time today while the storm is being cleared. Thank you very much indeed.
Now we will start the first panel. So I introduce the panelists, and then first I'd be delighted to introduce the first speaker of the first panel, Professor Diana Newton, my friend, and we sometimes call each other partner in crime, and we do a lot of things. Professor Newton is the director of the Tower Scholars Program, professor of the practice of the political science department, senior fellow of the SMU Tower Center. And she is the Japan specialist, only Japan specialist, teaching at SMU before I came to SMU. So she also hired me. And since then, we have done a lot of collaboration. It's every time I work with Diana, it's so much fun. So thank you, Diana. And then please join me for welcoming Professor Newton.
Thank you so much, Professor Takeuchi. Thanks to all of you for coming out today on a wet Saturday morning. I also, before I start, just want to thank some of the Keio staff who helped serve us dinner last night. And they were really wonderful. I don't see any of them here today, but I was really grateful for their extra effort. So I am supposed to talk about U.S.-Japan relationship from the U.S. perspective. And I'm going to start with a quote. When asked what most affects the course of strategic planning by governments, former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of the United Kingdom from 1957 to 1963 allegedly responded, "Events, my dear boy, events." Despite the lack of proof that he actually said this, the quote has gained traction because of its humor and its applicability. And the statement, I think, applies to our examination today of the U.S.-Japan relationship, an alliance of hope. Professor Takeuchi asked us to answer that question. And prime ministers and presidents do not choose the events that shape and influence their tenures in office. And this is certainly true of President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Kishida Fumio today. The other thing that one cannot choose is one's geography. As we examine the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship, I would like to start by considering these two items that the countries can not only not change, but also need to acknowledge to come up with a successful strategy for moving forward to make the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship a hopeful one. Many have noted that U.S. geography has been essential to aiding us in our success. After all, our neighbors are two friendly nations and two oceans. We will be devoting a panel later today to Mexico. So that is a whole nother issue. We won't cover Canada, but I think it's fair to say that our geographic situation has been kind to the United States. Hovering on the edge of the Pacific, Japan finds itself in a completely different neighborhood despite our shared ocean. While its contiguous neighbors are only ocean, its immediate neighbors are range from wary to aggressive. Japan's need for good friends in such a neighborhood is clear, and the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship has lasted so long and grown so strong because the friendship provides mutual benefit. Japan's strategic position on the easternmost edge of the Asian landmass is attractive to the United States, which has long used Japan's geography to project force into the region. If we add current events to these immutable geographic realities, the bilateral relationship conversation gets even more interesting. With China's recent ramping up of its claims over Taiwan, it is suddenly quite relevant that Japan's Yonaguni Island at the end of Okinawa's island chain sits a little more than 100 kilometers or a little less than 70 miles from Taiwan. This makes Japan feel like it is on the front lines of any potential conflict surrounding Taiwan. Recent Chinese flashes of anger over Taiwan's lack of compliance to rejoin China have been evident in planned speeches, outbursts of frustration, repudiations of foreign recognition of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, military flyovers, and trainings with live ammunition. All these recent actions taken by Chinese leadership have combined to impact the strategic choices of Japan and the United States. The most obvious evidence of this is Japan's 2022 commitment to increase its defense spending up to 2% of GDP over the next 5 years, its recent plans to update the command and control arrangements for US and Japanese forces, and preliminary discussions to open a NATO liaison office in Tokyo. If we look at another next door neighbor, North Korea, Japan finds itself with an additional reason to increase defense spending and improve its relationship with military allies in the Pacific. North Korea has tested about 100 missiles since early 2022, several of which have flown over or landed in waters that are in Japanese territory. In response to North Korean saber rattling, the United States and South Korea embarked on live fire exercises, simulating a full-scale attack from North Korea about 10 days ago. Both the US and South Korea stated that the purpose of these exercises is to preserve peace by showing overwhelming military capability against North Korea. Not to be outdone, between the time that I boarded my plane in Dallas and landed in Tokyo, North Korea rushed to launch its own military spy satellite on Thursday morning. Although the launch failed, Japan had put missile defenses on alert, and the Japanese Minister of Defense, Hamada Yasukazu, announced that Japan would be ready to shoot down fragments likely to fall on Japanese soil from any North Korean satellite launch. While that was unnecessary on Thursday, these are events, my dear boy, events. In locations too close to Japan to be ignored and too threatening for the United States to turn a blind eye, given its pledges to defend Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. China's interest in absorbing Taiwan into its sovereign territory and Kim Jong-un's multiple missile launches are but two of the major events affecting the US-Japan relationship and impacting the Kishida-Biden relationship. There are many other events, and I'd like to mention two in particular that have taken place, that have not taken place in the Asia Pacific region per se, but are having an outsized impact there. The first is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the second is America's political polarization, both of which we talked about a little bit last night in Ambassador Schiefer and his remarks in Q&A. With regard to Russia's invasion in February 2022, with the explicit blessing of China, the entire world developed a sense of dread about the blatant disregard for international norms like sovereignty. This was especially true in the Pacific Rim, where it was not difficult to draw comparisons between Russia's justification for its invasion of its neighbor as just reclaiming territory that belongs to us, and China's insistence that Taiwan is part of its country and should be reclaimed as such. After witnessing Russia and China's cozying up at the 2022 Olympics in China weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, and additional supportive rhetoric after the invasion by China, the United States and the Biden administration began working immediately to beef up the US-Japan bilateral relationship and dismiss some of the ambiguity around the long-term policy of strategic ambiguity that the US has applied to the question of will we or won't we defend Taiwan in the face of a Chinese invasion. Japan announced at the end of last year that it would double defense spending and develop counterattack capabilities. More recently, in the lead up to the G7 meeting in Hiroshima last month, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, announced in January the anticipated arrival of the 12th Marine Littoral Regiment on Okinawa, which Austin described, quote, as an outfit that's more lethal, more agile, more capable, that will bolster deterrence in the region and allow us to defend Japan and its people more effectively. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also announced in January that under the US-Japan Security Alliance, the concept of mutual defense now explicitly covered cyberspace and outer space. There is a deepening and broadening of the US-Japan Security Alliance, as well as a renewed, one could say post-Trump, emphasis on strengthening alliances elsewhere, including the US, Japan, Australia, India alliance, also known as the Quad, the US, South Korea, Japan relationship, and even the Australia, UK, US AUKUS alliance, which even though it does not include Japan, brings Europe into the Pacific in a very real way, as does the recent bilateral defense agreement between Japan and the UK. Although the growth of these relationships and the intertwining of capabilities and commands in direct response to regional negative threats and events, even though that is a direct response to these threats, the result has been a strengthening and a multiplying of relationships that will serve America and the US and Japan well. And finally, one of the most depressing events for me that is not taking place in Asia, but has an outsized impact on the region is the deep polarization of the United States population and the massive dysfunction in US government that does not show signs of abating anytime soon. As we head into a presidential election next November, it is shaping up to be both ugly and uncertain, as there is a loss of faith in institutions, in the people that run them, and in the candidates we already know are going to be running. Fear drives the polarization in the United States, whether it is fear of traditional American values changing, a fear of inequalities and injustices being imposed on some segments of US society, a fear of individual freedoms being curtailed, or a fear of religion and regionalism having too much sway. And until we agree that there is some truth to all of these fears and that the majority of folks on all sides have a valid point and that we need to listen to each other and make choices that represent a compromise of views, I fear that the Americans will continue to spin our wheels in the discontent, in the mud of our discontent and divisiveness. Okay, before we get too depressed, I want to reassure you that the outlook is not all bad. There have been some positive events shaping the bilateral relationship that bend the arc towards hope. Last year brought the election of Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, who came to office extending an olive branch to Japan in hopes of improving relations in the face of multiple security threats that he too faces in the same geographic neighborhood as Japan. President Yoon has prioritized the trilateral relationship among the US, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, which is something the United States has long been pushing for. There also have been advances among the three nations on the military side, and this too is hopeful. China's overreach has made many countries leery of it, rather than endearing it to many. The Belt and Road Initiative has helped hit some snags along the way with unfavorable terms and repossessions. Chinese domestic repression of speech, information, and economy has been unpopular outside of China. Inside of China, critics have been effectively silenced. The systematic repression of Hong Kong and its entire way of life that was supposed to be enshrined in Deng Xiaoping's one party, two systems has given many in the world pause. Most nations and their leaders prefer to have an economic relationship with China, but do not want Chinese-style leadership controlling their country. With the exception of some autocrats who admire the iron fist of Xi's rule, like some of our past president and current presidential candidate. Another hopeful turn of events worth mentioning is Japan's strong leadership in the region and around the world. It is clear that the investments that Japan made in terms of diplomatic heft in the Abe years were neither insignificant nor linked to that one individual prime minister. Japan has nurtured relationships in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, that have resulted in deep respect among the 9 other ASEAN nations for Japan's leadership and policy orientation. Japan has also shown its mettle in terms of concluding important trade agreements throughout the region. When the United States walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was so ably negotiated by Ambassador Kirk, Japan doubled down and concluded the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, without the United States. In addition, Japan worked to conclude the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which is the world's largest free trade agreement, boasting 15 countries and 31% of the world's GDP. The United States is a party to neither trade agreement, and given our governmental dysfunction, this is unlikely to change soon. Japan has avoided such a narrow worldview. Most recently, Japan's leadership was on display at the G7 meeting that just concluded in Hiroshima. Japan shone on the world stage, hosting leaders from around the global north and forcing them to come to terms with damage and destruction at the Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima. Having visited myself, I think it is a powerful place to hold a meeting because it showcases Japan's strength at this time. I think Japan was willing to make the other leaders a little bit uncomfortable as they laid wreaths to honor the dead. It was not a summit at a chic, beautiful resort, but rather at the site of a massacre. It takes some understanding of one's leadership and power to pull that off. And I give Japan big kudos for doing so. Inviting Australia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Korea, and Ukraine as special guests was also really brilliant. And Volodymyr Zelensky's in-person visit allowed the G7 nations to show off a general consensus among the world's largest economies to preserve institutions and oppose rule breaking that is happening in Tehran, China, Russia, North Korea, to name a few. This was due to Japan's leadership, plain and simple. And the United States is reaping the benefits of that leadership at a time when the United States is having trouble marshaling its own. My final positive event is the Kishida-Biden pull-aside bilateral meeting on the margins of the G7, which I think was a great success for both countries. The two leaders covered a myriad of collaborative topics, including but not limited to support for Ukraine. Kishida and Biden, along with their G7 colleagues, also discussed supply chain resilience for stronger economic ties and protection of critical technologies, which the G7 nations have termed diversification and de-risking rather than decoupling from China. Biden and his subordinates reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to defend Japan, including using nuclear weapons, and both leaders went on the record to demand that North Korea relinquish its atomic bombs. Beyond the talking points, I would also highlight that the Kishida and Biden in their meetings appear to have the chemistry of a very positive personal relationship, which often makes the difference between an alliance on paper and an alliance of consequence. So given these events, I think there are two interesting questions to answer as we examine the long, strategic, and hopeful relationship between the U.S. and Japan. One, will Japan deliver on its promises to increase defense spending and remain engaged as a leader in the region and the globe? And two, will the U.S. continue to be a reliable partner to Japan, which I think also begs the question of will liberalism prevail over populism in the U.S.? All right, question number one, will Japan deliver on its promises? So the answer to this question actually falls more in the portfolio of Mori sensei, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts as part of the panel. Even though I don't have the perspective to give a reliable answer to this question, from where I sit, I would guess the answer is yes. While the Japanese people have reasonable, even responsible concerns about increasing their nation's military footprint and capabilities, Japan is not ready to give up on the international norms which the global community is based, and even on the United States itself, which is saying something. I would describe Japan's stature as brave, bold, and no longer hiding behind the United States. And I expect that it will deliver on its promises, even if the path to getting there is not a straight line. While I believe that Japan must find its own way to craft and pay for its Nomaru nation status, I also think Jenny Lind got it right in her recent op-ed in the New York Times in mid-May, and I quote, "If Japan leaders are indeed committed to resisting Chinese dominance of Asia, they must view their country as the equivalent of West Germany during the Cold War, highly threatened, at the center of geopolitical competition, and contributing significantly to its own defense." She went so far as to say that 2% of GDP is not enough defense spending, but that falls within Professor Galui's portfolio, so I'll let him talk about that. Question number two, will the United States be a reliable partner, and will liberalism prevail over populism? The fact that Biden's trip to the Pacific was cut short by the need to return to Washington to re-engage in debt ceiling talks was, in a word, embarrassing. The fact that the president cannot be away from the country or expect his staff and the Republican majority on Capitol Hill to be able to work together to make decisions about the future of the U.S. economy not only reflects our dysfunction, but it undermines American power and reliability. Other aspects of our toxic polarization color the bilateral relationship as well. For example, on trade, as I mentioned earlier, we led on TPP, we created it, we pulled out, and now we cannot manage to rejoin, but are focusing on a weaker and less important agreement, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. The idea that Republicans have touted reducing funding for Ukraine has shocked the Japanese because supporting Ukraine feels like a parallel to preserving freedom in East Asia and relates directly to Taiwan's future. It is not a sound policy choice, but a pre-presidential election tactic designed to appeal to certain elements of Donald Trump's base. So my conclusion here is the same as my answer to question one. Yes, but. However, I have to admit a little less faith in the American public than in the Japanese public. And to quote another British prime minister who was mentioned last night, I expect that the United States will do the right thing, but in the words of Winston Churchill, after they have tried everything else. While I lean towards optimism, it is a tempered optimism. If my optimism were a balloon, it would be partially deflated, sagging a little bit. But I put my hope in the large swaths of the middle of our country who abhor the polarization. And from the remarkably uneventful midterm elections of November 2022, we all expected more vitriol, more alternative facts, more election verification disputes, and even more violence. Fortunately, that did not materialize. And for the most part, the major 2020 presidential election deniers did not win their elections. Of course, what will happen in the 2024 presidential election remains unknown and looms large here. But I will say also the compromise on the debt ceiling that happened in the past 24, 36 hours also was reason for hope. So in conclusion, it's a difficult time right now for the United States and the world. Tensions are high, polarizations abound. Institutional norms seem under attack, and social media drives actions and reactions in ways we have never experienced. But in difficult times, you need a good friend, and Japan has been that friend to the United States over and over again. I think it's fair to say the United States has been that friend to Japan as well. As we move beyond the unipolar moment, I believe the United States has never needed good friends so much. Japan is the first among equals, leading the U.S. to participate in multilateral strategic relationships that serve both countries very well. There is strength in standing together. There is hope. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Dr. Satoru Mori, professor of political science at Keio University. Actually, I had a last meal in Japan before pandemic with Satoru Mori-san at the annual meeting of Japan Association of International Relations in Niigata in November 2019, if I remember correctly. And then I never thought that would be the last meal for a while after that. So I'm so glad to see you, and then to have to work together. I have known for a long time that Mori-san is a great scholar. I'm a big fan of his writing. This time what I found is that he's a great administrator. Working together with Mori-san to organize this conference was so much fun. And then he helped me a lot. So thank you very much. And please join me for welcoming Dr. Mori.
First of all, I want to thank the SMU Tower Center for having me here today. It's a real privilege to be able to speak among distinguished panelists. And special thanks to Hiroki Takeuchi for inviting me to this panel. I really appreciate this opportunity. So the title of my presentation today is Japan's Security Challenge and the Japan-US Alliance. Okay. Oops. Okay. The main question that I'll be addressing is, what are some of the major efforts that Japan is undertaking in the area of security, and what are some of the big tasks ahead? So let me give you my bottom lines up front. First, I want to establish a baseline by making an obvious point about Japan's security outlook by stating that Japan's three strategic documents issued in December 2022 clearly characterized China as its primary security challenger. While they did not characterize it as a threat, what does this mean? I will elaborate on this point later on. Second, in the area of defense, deterring China's use of force vis-a-vis Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands is the central objective of Japan's defense policy, and efforts are now underway on the part of Japan to fundamentally bolster its defense capability and deepen defense cooperation with the United States and other like-minded countries. But when it's about strengthening deterrence, in addition to capabilities, intentions matter as well. With regard to issues of war and peace, state intentions are not only about official policy stated in documents and speeches, but also about public resolve to not back down in the event of a major crisis with an adversary. However, there remains a question about how firm the publics of Japan, the United States, and Taiwan are when it comes to deterring and countering Chinese aggression. The political will is going to be critical when push comes to shove, and there needs to be a framework of mind that will fully take into account the strategic significance of Taiwan to our respective countries' security and future independence and freedom. And this will not happen overnight, so we have to prepare in advance. Third, forging a free and open Indo-Pacific is easily said than done. The Japanese government released a newly modified version of its free and open Indo-Pacific, which consists of 4 pillars. But one of the challenges is to engage the so-called global South that includes a highly diverse set of states. And this will require us to accept diversity of values on the one hand, while at the same time keeping in mind liberal values. This is what I mean when I say we need multi-layered cooperative arrangements that will blend pluralistic and universalistic approaches to engage non-democratic states. Lastly, I want to conclude by stating that a culture of innovation and transformation are critical to swiftly adapting to the rapidly shifting strategic landscape. And under these circumstances, international exchange of various kinds are important to stimulate out-of-the-box thinking and enhance adaptability of nations. So now I would like to slightly elaborate on some of these points. Okay, so regarding Japan's security outlook, based on conversations that I have had with Japanese government officials responsible for organizing the strategic documents, one of the main punchlines that they wanted to convey was on page 2 of the National Security Strategy, and I quote, "Russia's aggression against Ukraine has easily breached the very foundation of the rules that shape the international order. The possibility cannot be precluded that a similar serious situation may arise in the future in the Indo-Pacific region, especially in East Asia," end of quote. This is the now familiar line, "Today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia," which essentially expresses the Japanese government's concern over Taiwan. Concern regarding China in the military realm stem from not only China's coercive actions, but also from the rapidly growing Chinese nuclear arsenal as forecasted by the Pentagon's China Military Power Report, and also the rapidly expanding Chinese missile inventory, particularly theater-range ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as hypersonic weapons. US and Japanese bases apparently remain vulnerable to saturation attacks, and there is growing concern both in Tokyo and Washington about the eroding conventional deterrence. In Tokyo, initially, experts focused on an all-out Chinese attack scenario, but more recently, they have become focused more on examining more ambiguous situations that would make it difficult for Japan and the United States to intervene, such as a blockade/quarantine scenario by China around Taiwan, in the absence of a direct attack on the US or Japan. The assumption here is that they would try to avoid getting Japan involved and make it difficult for the US to intervene. I'll come back to this point later on. But it is also important to take note that the Japanese government does not characterize China as a threat, because that would basically mean that it must work to eliminate the governing body. That in essence would mean shutting down diplomatic channels and imposing comprehensive economic sanctions. But this is not Japan's China policy. Japan's national security strategy states that Japan will build a constructive and stable relationship with China. This is now a standard phrase used by the Kishida government. The former Abe government used the term mutually beneficial relationship to refer to Japan-China relations. And Hu Jintao reciprocated its use, but Xi Jinping did not use this term. So there is this now a sort of a recognition within the Japanese government that it would be very difficult to go back to the state of relations that existed prior to the 2010 Senkaku fishing boat incident. So the term stable and constructive appears to imply that the bilateral relationship needs to be managed rather than aim to produce breakthroughs on difficult issues. Lastly, the documents imply that North Korea and Russia come second and third in the hierarchy of security challenges. This does not mean that they are negligible, but it has become quite clear that China is the primary security challenge for Japan. Okay. So from here, I want to first talk about defense and then talk about diplomacy. So first on defense. It was widely reported that the Kishida government made a big decision to fundamentally bolster its defense capabilities. The Japanese government is looking to achieve 2% of the most recent GDP, which is supposed to amount to 11 trillion per year, 11 trillion yen per year. 8.9 trillion yen will be devoted to defense budget per se at the end of the 5th year. And the remaining 2.1 trillion yen will be spent on A, boosting defense-related R&D, B, enhancing resilience of public infrastructure, and C, strengthening active cyber defense, and D, official security assistance, which is basically provision of assistance to foreign militaries, which is unprecedented. There will be several sources to fund the whole program, which is expected to amount to a total of 43 trillion yen over the 5 years, from 2023 to 2027. And the most controversial one is the tax increase. Only half of the Japanese public support tax increase as an option to fund defense. The Prime Minister will have to persuade the public and the Diet members to dampen concerns and overcome resistance. I have currently no idea how the Japanese politics will unfold over this issue over the next year or so, but we will have to see. According to the National Defense Strategy, the Japanese government will invest in 7 key capability areas, but I won't get into the details for now, but they involve new capabilities such as counter-strike capabilities and active cyber defense capabilities. So what are the strategic significance of these efforts to bolster national defense? Let me see. Yes. Japan's national security strategy and the national defense strategy sets out 2 timeframes, 2027 and 2032. And they basically say that Japan will take the primary responsibility for dealing with invasions against its nation, against its own, and that it will aim to eventually be capable of disrupting and defeating invasions against itself much earlier and at a further distance. The implications of this is that if many of the programs are actually implemented and realized, then the respective roles of Japan and the United States are envisioned to shift from a function-based division of labor to a theater-based division of labor. What do I mean by that? It means that traditionally, Japan-US Defense Cooperation had a narrow scope focused on the defense of Japan, where the US was the spear and Japan was the shield. If all the programs involved in these strategic documents materializes, then Japan will assume the role of spear for its own defense, devote itself to the defense of Japan so that it will enable the US forces to concentrate more on the defense of Taiwan. Thus, Japan taking primary responsibility for its own defense, while the US defends the US defends Taiwan, and both Japan and the US, as well as Taiwan, respond to China from their respective theater of operations. Hence, a functional-based to a theater-based division of labor. However, there are 2 issues that Japan needs to tackle, one related to capabilities and another related to national intention or resolve necessary to buttress deterrence. On the capability side, the Japan Self-Defense Force is very low on preparedness or readiness. It has been reported that their general operational rate is at 50% of what is required. They face serious shortages of parts of various kinds, as well as ammunitions. The number of interceptors for ballistic missile defense is only 60% of what is required. So the JSDF, or the Japan Self-Defense Force, needs to begin by replenishing parts and ammunitions that are in shortages. On the intention side, I believe the Japanese government is quite firm in its resolve to respond appropriately to a Taiwan crisis or a contingency if it were ever to happen. However, the story is different when it comes to public opinion. I have never seen a public opinion poll asking the Japanese people whether Japan should support US military operations to defend Taiwan in the face of a Chinese threat to retaliate by using all means necessary. If the US makes a decision to run a blockade, for example, that is suffocating Taiwan and gain access to Taiwan, and China threatens that it will retaliate using all necessary means in the hope of deterring the US and Japan, then there is likely to be somewhat of a panic inside Japan. Stock markets will fall, stock market prices will probably fall, and anti-war protesters are likely to grow in number. Chinese information operation to instigate war scare in Japan could dissuade a large portion of the Japanese public to be hesitant to get involved in an armed conflict. And the cabinet would be cornered into a very difficult position. So under those circumstances, if the prime minister decides to support the US and the US intervenes, and then China retaliates by shooting missiles, and Japan sustains casualties, then depending on the level of opposition, that particular war cabinet could fall. Cabinet could be forced into resignation if they lose the confidence of the Diet, and leaders are susceptible to this kind of pressure in a parliamentary democracy. So public reaction to a Taiwan crisis is thus critically important. When push comes to shove, public resolve to defend Taiwan would be exposed. My observation might be limited, but I get the sense that discussions about how Japan could get involved in the Taiwan contingency is narrowly focused on the immediate consequences of the conflict over Taiwan, such as will Chinese missile hit bases in Okinawa, how many people will suffer casualties, and etc. But if the issue is framed from such a narrow perspective, people will not appreciate the full strategic significance of Taiwan to Japanese security and future. Under those circumstances, many Japanese citizens will ask, why should my life be endangered by a conflict over Taiwan? We should not be getting into a war with China over Taiwan. Chinese influence operations could further inflame this sort of absolute pacifist sentiment. If they are successful in generating nationwide debates and protests about trying to avert war by refraining from supporting the United States, then the Japanese government will be cornered into a very difficult position, as I mentioned before. If the cabinet supports the US and Japan suffers casualties from a Chinese retaliatory attack, then that cabinet could fall. And if anti-war sentiments were to be very strong, then the succeeding cabinet might not have any choice but to opt for reversing course and terminate cooperation or support to the US. If this happens, then the US will not be able to wage effective military operations from Japan, and Taiwan will lose hope of resisting Chinese aggression. From China's perspective, this will be killing 3 birds with 1 stone. This means that one of the centers of gravity in US-Japan-Taiwan coalition warfare will be Japanese public opinion. So preparing the Japanese public to stand firm to resist aggression is critical for both deterrence and defense. As long as the Japanese public believes that Taiwan is Taiwan, they would be susceptible to Chinese influence operations, as well as negative pacifism that already exists inside Japanese society. Japanese public needs to weigh the consequences of Chinese control of Taiwan, which would dramatically change Japan's and US's strategic environment. The prospect of Chinese regional hegemony will be much more realistic if that happens, and Japan will be exposed to extremely high Chinese pressure to accept Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. Japanese defense expenditure will probably have to be dramatically increased further, and the general outlook will be much more dystopian. So how the Taiwan issue is framed and understood will be critical to shaping the Japanese public's reaction to Taiwan crisis or contingency. And there is much difficult work to be done ahead. So now I want to, oh, sorry, I was supposed to show this slide much earlier, so I apologize for that. Let me move on to the diplomatic side. So now I want to move on to diplomacy. The central task is to promote a free and open rules-based international order. And Japan, during the Abe government, launched the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific. Subsequently, more recently, should I say, in March 2023, the Kishida government renewed this framework and categorized various engagement initiatives under 4 different pillars, as I am showing here. I'm not going to read them out. One of the major tasks ahead under the free and open Indo-Pacific is to engage the so-called global South. And this agenda also came up in the most recent G7 summit held at Hiroshima. But I believe there are some questions that need to be addressed when we think about how to engage the global South. Some questions that need to be addressed are, what is the global South implications for our rules-based order building or order promotion strategy? What are the main objectives of our global South engagement strategy? How do we know whether our engagement strategy is making progress or not? And this probably depends on how we define our objectives. And, based on some of the answers that we will probably have, I'm sorry, So based on how we think about these questions, a well-coordinated, multi-layered cooperative arrangements vis-a-vis the Global South is needed. And I may sound a little bit abstract, but I think a delicate and tailored blend of pluralistic and universalistic approaches are required. And some of the following questions would be, can Japan and the United States undertake such a balanced and sustainable approach in the mid to long term? For example, the Quad is one among many other regional frameworks that we can work together, but we should have goals and targets rather than just deploy resources without knowing whether those investments are making a difference. A new vision for perhaps a joint economic growth with Global South countries is probably needed. Investments and development is yet to be formed. So to conclude, this may sound bland, but I think one of the key challenges to manage East Asian security is to be strategically adaptive to the shifting environment. The international security landscape shifts so rapidly, so we will have to adapt to rapid changes. Strategic adaptability will require us to challenge existing assumptions, and this would be enabled by engaging in international intellectual exchanges and generating new cross-border talent flows among allies and like-minded states like Japan and the United States. And I hope this venue will serve as one of the vehicles to promoting this course. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop here. Thank you.
The third speaker is Professor Professor Jason Galui. Jason has three aspects of his roles at SMU. First, he is Lieutenant General of Army, retired, and he is very familiar with national security of the United States. He is expected to play the role of teaching national security, but especially focusing on the leadership in the U.S. Army. And secondly, he is currently at SMU engaged in the project called coercive diplomacy. I'm sorry, commercial diplomacy. Commercial diplomacy, very different, sorry. So he actually is emphasizing the importance of the relationship between business and security, and then business has a positive impact on enhancing the security, which I totally agree with you. So he is running the commercial diplomacy program in SMU Cox School of Business. Thirdly, he is a resident of a city called Prosper, Texas. That is about 30 miles from downtown Dallas. Which is quite far, but actually in the Texas standard, it's not that far. And he commutes from it. I myself live in Saxe, which is not that far, but in Texas, more and more people live in suburb and then a commute, and then it's quite convenient. And then I mention this because in the post-pandemic world, it seems that more people live remote and then work from home and more time working from home. So they choose where to live. The proximity or distance to the workplace is not that important. And in that case, Prosper, Texas is in a very good position. And then actually population is increasing like 10 times in last 10 years. And then it's actually not just Prosper, Texas, but also many other small cities in Texas near Dallas, Houston, and then other big cities are like that. So that's actually a new model that is going on in the United States. And perhaps that will solve the problem of the political division of the United States. That's actually what I thought. But anyway, and then fourthly, most importantly, Jason is a very good friend of mine, newer friend. But we always have a very good discussion and conversation when we have lunch or a coffee. So please join me for welcoming Jason Galui.
Well, thanks, Hiroki. And my commute from Prosper to Dallas though in distance is twice the distance as I live from Fairfax, Virginia to Washington. The time is actually shorter from Prosper to Dallas than Fairfax to downtown Washington. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with you. The first post-pandemic Sun and Star Symposium. It's an honor to be here. I want to first thank everyone who made it possible. Everyone who's all logistics, all the administration putting it together, and thank you to everyone for taking time to travel and be here on this wet Saturday morning. I want to start actually a little off script, though I let our interpreters know that I'm not going completely off script right away. But Ambassador Schiefer mentioned something last night that struck me when he talked about that 50-mile Russian tank column and their inability to resupply and stalling before it could really make inroads into Ukraine. I want to mention it because it reminded me of 2002 when I was a young lieutenant in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and we were preparing for the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And as a young tank platoon leader, I was given the task from our squadron commander to assess whether or not we could resupply from Turkey down to Baghdad if the plan could survive as designed. And I did some analysis and went back to the colonel and said, no, sir, the logistics train would have to move at this point to this point if we want to keep our pace and arrive to Baghdad per our plan. He went back to the generals and told them we couldn't do it. We never really, we did not have the chance to try from Turkey, as Turkey decided not to let us use their territory. But the point of that story was it highlights a key difference between the U.S. Army and our allied forces and some of the adversaries that we could face in the future, such as the Russians or the Chinese. Our leaders trusted us. They took our advice. When we said, no, sir, we can't do this, they listened. And clearly in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, perhaps in the Russian military, they were afraid to say no or did not feel trusted or empowered. So I think that's something I'm going to highlight toward the end of my remarks, but I think it's important as I'll talk about this qualitative difference between the United States, Japan, and our allies and partners, and those perhaps on the other side of the spectrum. This symposium is well-timed, Hiroki, with the Shangri-La dialogue happening at the same time in Singapore. So my hope is that our conversations here are quite relevant and timely, and will reflect what many of the security and defense leaders who are meeting as we speak, it will reflect their conversations. When Hiroki mentioned the theme of the symposium would be uncertainty, my first thought was that, well, the world is always uncertain. Nobody knows the future. And in fact, it might be the case that uncertainty is the only certainty we have. But upon deeper reflection, I thought about the degrees of uncertainty of the world over our time. Today's world is perhaps the most uncertain it has been in most of our lifetimes. The Cold War, while volatile and complex, had less uncertainty overall. Most countries knew which side they were on. The immediate post-Cold War period, while more uncertain than during the Cold War, given the fall of the bipolar world we all knew, was less uncertain than our world today. The decade and a half following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, was also less uncertain than the world we have today. Today's world is vastly different. To reiterate a thesis from a government paper I wrote about 10 years ago, in that paper, I claimed that the most significant change to the international and national security environment was the combination of the increased number of influential players on the world stage and the speed at which information traveled. That combination of increased number of players and the speed of information yields a very high level of uncertainty. Something that I know I am certain about, and I think I can safely speak for others in this room, is the certainty of the strength of the US-Japan alliance. I've heard this phrase over and over again, is that it might be the strongest it's ever been. And that's from people who have been involved in the alliance for much of the past several decades. So then when thinking about operating in an uncertain world, I thought of, what do you do when there's uncertainty? I thought, well, first we have to have an ability to assess the situation. Then you need to have an ability to anticipate what might be ahead. And then you should prepare to be agile when your anticipation is incorrect. So what I'd like to do is walk through how the US-Japan alliance is pursuing each of those 3 A's. How is it assessed? How is it anticipating? And what are we doing as an alliance to be agile when we get the anticipation incorrectly? And along that path, I want to offer a framework to help think about where we are in time and space. This framework is something called the critical juncture model, which I first encountered in Kent Calder and Minier's book, The Making of Northeast Asia. They defined a critical juncture as an historical decision point at which there are clear alternative paths to the future. And they noted 3 key features of such a decision point. 1, that there's a crisis calling into serious question the legitimacy of the current arrangement. 2, that the crisis breeds a stimulus for change while generating a need for collective action to address common problems. And 3rd, there's a time pressure, which adds to the challenge of the situation. When thinking about the world's future direction today, I think it's clear that there are alternative paths to the future. Some have simply assessed it as one toward a free democratic way of life versus authoritarian regimes. And I think it should be clear, especially hearing Diana and Satoru's comments today, that we are at a critical juncture. And I hope my comments complement what they said. So in assessing the situation, I thought first of a question that I posed to cadets when I taught at West Point several years ago. And that was relative to East Asia. With the prosperity and the increased levels of international cooperation we have enjoyed throughout the post-World War II period, provide a foundation for political cooperation and effective management of security problems. The initial responses really fell into 3 buckets. One was that the prosperity was a result of the peace, and the credit for the relative peace was given to the power and leadership of the United States. The second bucket was that the peace stemmed from regional prosperity. Think economic interdependence theory. Third was a group that were skeptical that peace was linked to economic activity at all. Regardless of where you might fall into those buckets, my assessment is that the economic foundation today has weakened. And in fact, it may be the case that the economic challenges are now a source of conflict when we once saw them as a source of stability and interdependence. In thinking about pre-pandemic time, I went back to UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly in 2019. Then Secretary General Gutierrez cautioned the world against splitting in two, with the United States and China creating rival internets, currency, trade, financial rules, and quote, their own zero-sum geopolitical and military strategies. Secretary General Gutierrez further stated that the risk may not yet be large, but it's real. He went on to challenge the member states to do everything possible to avert the great fracture and maintain a universal system, a universal economy with universal respect for international law, a multipolar world with strong multilateral institutions. Interestingly, post-pandemic, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the United Kingdom, we all have different leaders today than we did before the pandemic. And these leadership changes have created momentum that has strengthened the region from an alliance perspective. Interestingly, China, Russia, North Korea, 3 of the countries that Ambassador Schiefer mentioned last night, they all have the same leader. And we know that these leaders will remain in power for the foreseeable future. That's a strategic advantage for us. We know who they will be. General Secretary Xi Jinping has consolidated his power and grip on the Communist Party. And the irony that I thought about last night as Ambassador Schiefer was talking was that in pursuit of their power consolidation, those leaders may have inadvertently organized much of the developed world against them and thus been catalysts for the strengthening of our alliances. In terms of the post-pandemic Indo-Pacific region assessment, I think it can best be summed up in one line from Prime Minister Kishida's 2022 Shangri-La dialogue, which Satoru mentioned. And that was, Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, referencing the potential for a Taiwan contingency. Coming out of the G7 Hiroshima leaders communique, They declare that member states are more united than ever in our determination to meet the global challenges of this moment and to set the course for a better future, choosing the first alternative path that I mentioned. Sadly, I don't think we're going to heed Secretary General Gutierrez's warning from 2019. It's an exceptionally dynamic time in the region. A lot has changed since the pandemic. And here's a quick summary of how I see what's going on in the region. My simple assessment. The US-China relationship is perhaps at its most challenging phase since 1979. The PLA is modernizing and increasing its assertiveness and aggressiveness throughout the region. North Korea, as you heard Diana mention, it's recent news, is more aggressively pursuing nuclear capability. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused folks to look at the possibility of a PRC invasion of Taiwan. In fact, members of the US House of Representatives Select Committee on China recently conducted a tabletop exercise about an incursion across the Taiwan Strait. And at the time, there was a pending vote, which I don't know if it actually happened, but a member of Congress mentioned that we need to, quote, arm Taiwan to the teeth. So, of course, there are always in the region the traditional maritime security concerns with two oceans and critical sea lanes that all have global implications for peace and prosperity. In response to these realities of what's going on in the region, we observe historic strategic alignment, perhaps unprecedented outside of active armed conflict. This is occurring across the set of US allies and partners in the region. All of the US alliances in the region are strengthening at the same time, and importantly, at the pace of US allies at their assessment, at their pace, at their assessment. The Australia, UK, US, AUKUS, there's an Australian initiative. President Yoon, on his visit to Washington, DC, then he and President Biden reaffirmed the Washington Declaration. President Marcos had a successful visit to the United States recently. Prime Minister Modi of India will visit Washington later this month. And of course, we've heard about, and we'll discuss more about Japan's new strategy from their December 2022 documents. There's a shared vision with our allies and partners. It's not a US only vision. It is a shared vision across all of our relationships. On Japan's new strategic documents, what I'll say is that it's a thoughtful response. It's a reflection of their assessment of what is going on in their neighborhood. The strategy states that this strategy will dramatically transform Japan's national security policy after the end of World War II from the aspect of its execution. These documents, as you heard Satoru mention, they define China as the greatest strategic challenge, North Korea as a grave and imminent threat, and Russia as a strong security concern. Jumping from those security documents to the G7 that Prime Minister Kishida hosted a few weeks ago. They're seeking to protect the international order and protect economic security by aligning the advanced democracies to defend the international rules-based order, conducting outreach to the global south, how we measure that yet to be determined, and to push back against China and Russia's efforts to disrupt the global order. In terms of economic security, the G7 seeks to strengthen supply chain resilience, protect critical technologies, and counter economic coercion. And trying to anticipate what's ahead. Areas of US-Japan cooperation. We have seen several areas of partnership and cooperation throughout the years. There's the Blue Dot Network, the Competitive Resilience Partnership, the Japan-US Strategic Digital Economy Partnership, and I could go on and list these partnerships. These areas of future cooperation in semiconductors, quantum, AI, 5G, and beyond. And anticipating what might be ahead in the region and globally, the United States and Japan, along with allies and partners, have been busy operationalizing the respective strategies. Strategy documents are only as good as one can implement. For the United States, in the security domain, really 3 lines of effort as we look at the activities. One is a realignment or an updating, perhaps, a modernizing of force posture throughout the region. The U.S. is seeking a more mobile, more distributed set of distribution, more transformative updates probably the most transformative updates we've seen in a generation. And these forces, as they exchange and work together, are like the cement between the bricks. You know, we can have stated goals and objectives and aligned interests, and could be cheap talk. But when you have forces that are operating together, that's that cement. That's a tribute to my dad, who's a mason, and I always have to work in a comment of bricks and mortar. But we're trying to modernize each alliance to strengthen deterrence and to defend the region. We've heard some mention of capabilities. In short, we've seen the US and UK announce sharing of nuclear submarine technology with Australia. Japan, based on their assessments, is pursuing acquisition of counterstrike capability. We're also seeing cooperation between Japan, the Philippines, Australia, India. And this is a part about networking. We're seeing the network of alliances continuing to grow, allies coming together in unprecedented ways. Over the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen a catalyzation of constellations coming together. US, Japan, South Korea, the Quad, US, Japan, Australia. And these relationships are new and different in the sense of their scope and their scale. And it's not just the US taking the lead on strengthening these alliances, it's allies reaching out to one another. Again, it's the strategic vision alignment between allies and partners, doing more together, fundamentally building trust with one another. In Japan, the newest strategic documents are necessary but insufficient. As Diana left a question to me to answer that I'll try to answer here on the fly. You know, will the 2% of GDP be enough? You know, you have to put the strategy into action. And Diana mentioned several recent activities, but I think about the qualitative military edge. So we can put a lot of dollars towards buying new equipment and platforms, but it's that qualitative aspect, going back to my comments of trusting young lieutenants and ensigns to execute strategy is critically important. And the more we do together, the better, the more trust we build with one another, and the more we can operate in combat situations. China, briefly, I'll say, is their increasing military capability and size presents several significant challenges. The first of which is a potential for a large-scale armed conflict, which I think is not in their best interest. The second, perhaps less observable and perhaps in their best interest, is a threat of a real long-term war of attrition. And that is not the traditional war of attrition that one might think from military history. I refer to this war of attrition as one where, through training exercises, China flies or sails close to sovereign territory, thus forcing Japan, Taiwan, or the United States to respond and thus wear down equipment. We hear the challenges of parts and maintenance. We sometimes forget how much maintenance is necessary to keep military equipment working in working conditions. So the more aggressive China's military is in some of these activities, the more likely it can be to wear down our militaries and their use. And following Sun Tzu, China would much prefer to bend the United States, Japan, and others to its will without firing any shots. So in terms of preparing for agility, we have to prepare for agility because we must be humble enough to realize our anticipation is likely to be wrong because we're human. And this ties to Satoru's comments about the need to be flexible and adaptable. Earlier, I referenced UNGA 2019 and Secretary General Gutierrez's remarks. For the post-pandemic, I'll go back to the G7. The G7 is taking concrete steps to support Ukraine for as long as it takes in face of Russia's illegal war. The second step is to strengthen disarmament and non-proliferation efforts towards the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons. And third, which I think this piece is very important for agility, is to coordinate an approach to economic resilience and economic security based on diversifying and deepening partnerships and de-risking, not decoupling. The G7 countries are determined to work together and with others to support a free and open Indo-Pacific and to oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. and to foster a strong and resilient global economic recovery. Key to this was one of the final statements that we welcome and further encourage efforts made by the private sector, universities, and think tanks, which contribute to realizing the free and open Indo-Pacific. For the United States and its allies and partners to win on today's and tomorrow's battlefields, whether those battlefields are kinetic or not, will require unprecedented collaboration between our private sectors, the public sectors, academia, and nonprofit organizations. It's what we're doing today. It's what we're doing with the Sun and Star Symposium. It's what we're doing, as Hiroki mentioned, with the Commercial Diplomacy Initiative at SMU. Our mission there is to enable a perpetual economic advantage for the United States, its allies and partners, while preserving the entrepreneurial principles and values. We aim to foster creative collaboration between government, the private sector, and academia. And that creative collaboration is defined as unstructured, decentralized, and relatively informal communication to solve common problems. Again, it's what we're doing here today. To remain agile requires an ability to innovate. To be innovative, we must maintain our creativity. And to put all of that together, we must, as an alliance, pursue creative collaboration. As part of the necessary collective action that is required at today's critical juncture, that will make it more likely than not that we will preserve the free and open societies that we all value so very much. Thank you.
The discussant of this panel is Dr. Jim Hollifield, director of the SMU Tower Center, my boss as a director of Tower Center, my colleague as in the political science department, and my friend. Welcome. Please join me for welcoming Dr. Jim Hollifield.
I think everybody knows that it doesn't do any good to be a boss unless you have some absolutely great troops and great followers. And, Hiroki has been a fantastic partner in this enterprise. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here on this rainy morning in this beautiful setting at Keio University. I have been given a somewhat difficult task because normally as a discussant in these academic sessions, you have papers to read in advance and you have time to think about them. So like, as we've heard about all of these democracies, we're going to have to be fast on our feet in this new uncertain environment. So I'm going to try to think fast on my feet here and respond and raise some questions. I think the role of a discussion is to ask some hard questions. So I apologize in advance if my questions are a bit brutal, too hard. And of course, we're always waiting for the grand synthesis, where I pull everything together, everything then makes perfect sense, and then we can move on to the next topic. But events, yes, indeed, events, my dear boy, events. History, unfortunately, is contingent. We've got some economists in the room here, and when economists are often asked a difficult question, I've heard this many times, they have a funny answer. They often say it depends. Depends. And I would quote another great American leader, Harry Truman, when he looked at his advisors one day and said, "Can you find me a one-handed economist?" And they were like, "What? A one-handed economist?" He said, "Every time I talk to an economist, they tell me, well, on the one hand, but then on the other hand. So if you can just get a one-handed economist, I'll get some straight answers here." Just to pick up on first on my colleague, Professor Newton's presentation, and I want to premise all this. I know there are a number of international relations scholars in the room here, and we all go back and forth in this field in social science between structure and agency, how much structure, how much agency. And Professor Newton pointed out one immutable fact, and that is geography. I mean, you can't really choose your neighbors. You are in the region where you are, and Japan is in a tough region. It has been for a long time. So often, geography drives the strategic environment, the strategic relationship. And again, I want to say some things that might seem a little bit harsh, but again, this is a way of sort of raising questions here. If you look at the history of the US-Japan relationship since the end of the Second World War, all of you in here are familiar with this history, you could make a case that Japan became a gigantic military base for the United States, a forward base for the United States. I don't want to use the term a client state. That might be a little bit too harsh, but I'll just throw that out there for you to think about. Well, there was a reason for this. Japan had been defeated by the US and its allies, and we almost immediately went into a very unusual strategic environment. You had a war in Korea, a revolution in China, and suddenly the US and Japan were undoubted allies. I mean, we were thrown together. I mean, we had to confront the situation in Korea, as you recall. We had to deal with this new hostile, dangerous China. This was the anti-communist coalition, if you will. Not much uncertainty there, a very clear strategic environment. I think everyone agree on this. But in spite of that being thrown together, and here's a question for the political scientists, the experts on Japan in the room, and I really want to stress this theme and get you to engage on this. In spite of that great certainty, it was not always wine and roses, shall we say. There were a lot of bumps along the way. And you all have alluded to Japanese politics. There was a lot of domestic opposition to the role of Japan as a forward military base. Some of you may remember the massive demonstrations, problems. Has this changed? It seems to really have abated. So we're in a new uncertain environment here. The strategic picture has shifted. So what's happened in Japan? Is it really now even more firmly in the US camp than it was during the Cold War period? Where is the opposition in Japan? That's a first question. I also want to say some things about China. China, of course, also went through many changes in the past decades. Ambassador Schiefer, Ambassador Kirk, who seems to have stepped out, may remember that our policy was one of constructive engagement. We were going to make China into a responsible stakeholder. I think that was the idea in the 90s, 2000s. And China was admitted into the WTO, a little bit with welcome arms, open arms. Russia, as we know, was in turmoil for much of the 1990s, so it was not really a threat or a player. But again, everything seemed to change very dramatically in the 2000s and especially 2010s. You have the coming to power of Chairman Xi. You have the coming, how should I put it, coming of age maybe of Vladimir Putin, President Putin. Fundamental shifts in the balance of power in East Asia. Suddenly an aggressive Russia. I mean, don't forget, Putin was invading lots of countries before he launched his massive invasion of Ukraine, and we weren't paying much attention to that. This was all sort of Putin's near abroad. We were sort of recognizing these spheres of influence, and there wasn't much stomach really in the West or in Japan for confronting this newly aggressive Russia. And then China, shifted very dramatically to become suddenly an expansive and aggressive power. So what happened to constructive engagement? What happened to China becoming a responsible stakeholder? I alluded last night, our pivot to Asia, again, just to reiterate what former Secretary Schultz said to me years ago at Stanford, we pivoted to Asia and the Russians invaded Ukraine. So one thing I took away from that was, the US, we don't have the United States does not have the luxury of simply stepping back and withdrawing from certain regions, assuming that they will remain calm. And of course, then you have the very dramatic change with the election of Donald Trump, which talk about uncertainty. This injected tremendous amounts of uncertainty into the strategic environment. The United States, again, looked very much like it did in the 1920s as an isolationist and protectionist power, withdrawing from TPP, and leaving Japan holding the ball, essentially. And Japan suddenly looking isolated, sitting out there, having to take a new leadership role. And I was curious, I think it was Mori sensei, or one of you said that, let's not call China an enemy, but, the threat environment in Asia changed very dramatically. And Prime Minister Abe Shinzo did step up. And Professor Newton in her presentation seemed very optimistic. I'd be curious if all of you share this optimism that Japan has really emerged into a new leadership role, a leadership position. But again, I go back to my basic point here. I would love to hear more from you in this room about what's going on in Japan, in terms of the domestic politics. And again, Mori Sensei, this was really much the gist of your presentation. I'll come back to that. And just to draw a line under my comments about the panel, about Professor Newton's work here. One thing is quite clear. We're back in a world where you have the democracies on the one hand, with all of their foibles and difficulties, and you have the autocracies on the other hand. So the world has become an incredibly messy place. Right now, our fate seems to be in the hands of Chairman Xi. Can you get into his mind and tell me what he's thinking? Is he going to invade Taiwan? And God help us, Vladimir Putin. And if you've been following all of his recent writings, he seems to have, he thinks he's Peter the Great, or, somebody who's going to reconstruct the Russian Empire. Donald Trump, talk about erratic, unpredictable leadership. I didn't hear much about Yoon Suk Yeol, South Korea, which is a democracy. Tsai Ing-wen, President Tsai. Anybody know much about her in Taiwan? And then we have the new President Marcos to the Philippines, who seems to be revealing his hand. What about Vietnam? What about Indonesia? What about India? I mean, we're back to we've got to get inside these leadership and the domestic politics of these countries. We're not in a comfortable Cold War, bipolar world where structure is dominating everything. To go to Mori Sensei's great presentation, again, Professor Newton alluded to this. If there's one theme you can take away from this panel, it's public resolve. That was the key thing. Is there public resolve? Do we have the stomach for this new challenge and this new fight? And public resolve is the key in a democracy, because democracies, governments depend on their legitimacy, on support from their people. And democracies, as I said when I first got up here, like me, you've got to be fast on your feet. You have to be willing to move. And Japan, I always thought of Japan as a very conservative place. The Japanese don't like change and uncertainty and risk. So is Japan going to shift now from being in the comfortable position of being a US forward military base and almost like a client state to taking the kind of leadership role in defending the international rules-based liberal order? I sense, to use a nice international relation term, I sense a lot of hedging going on. So I would like to hear Mori Sensei say about what's the hedging going on here. One term I've heard used in this new strategic environment in Asia is that a lot of countries have to look for multi-alignment. So you're now caught in a new sort of great game of power politics. And if you're in that great game, who's going to be the winner? Is it going to be the US? Is it going to be China? I'll come back to this in just a minute. So we're in a new kind of great power politics that we haven't seen since really the 19th century, I guess. I would like to think, as many of you have said already in this conference, that there's no question, there's no ambiguity with respect to Japan. We know where Japan will come out, that it stands squarely with the US. But again, hedging. Let's not call China an adversary. And when it comes to the decoupling from China, and I guess the term of art is de-risking. How many of you thought about this de-risking? I mean, this semantic difference between decoupling and de-risking. This is costly. It's really expensive. And Japan stands to lose an enormous amount of money. So, the economic interests of Japan may be in direct conflict with the security interest of Japan. So will economics, again, trump security here? There's some really hard choices. I've always said for decades, the biggest, most dangerous place in the world is the Taiwan Straits. I mean, this is the flashpoint. If we go into another world war, I think it will really be over Taiwan. North Korea obviously is a wild card. And the North Koreans seem to be certainly willing to play this wild card. So what will Japan do if China decides to invade Taiwan? I mean, you discussed this. I mean, I think this is, what will the United States do? Professor Galui, will the US come to the defense of Taiwan? President Biden has broken all the rules and said, absolutely, we will. And his advisors run out very quickly and said, oh, no, we're still not committed to this. So it seems to me that, we're back to looking at the structure of the international system. And I think Mori Sensei ended very much on this note. So we're now talking about the Indo-Pacific. We've got a new security architecture, the Indo-Pacific. And Ambassador Schiefer last night very adroitly pointed out that the key to peace is deterrence. And so have we constructed a new security architecture here that will deter China? And as you were giving your speech last night, I kept looking around the room and I was saying, where are the Chinese? If they were sitting here listening to your speech, what would they have said? I mean, they would have probably said, well, you can see what the US is up to. It simply wants to contain us, stop China from becoming a dominant power in East Asia. But the Chinese were not here, not represented, but they will have a say. They will have a voice in this. So, are we back to to use Thucydides and Graham Allison to a Thucydides trap, you know, that inevitably you've got a rising power, a declining power, and we know where that leads. Professor Galui, again, reminded me about the simple bipolarity of the Cold War era. You know, we've met the enemy. The enemy is nuclear. The enemy is dangerous. So it's clear, you know, what we have to do. Those certainties of the Cold War are gone. I don't think there ever was a unipolar moment. We talked a lot about that. I think that was a complete illusion. So we're back to a system of great power politics. Certainly Vladimir Putin is convinced of that. Again, more like the 19th century. So is it all going to end in tears as it did in 1914? I mean, you raised this question last night. Interdependence, Professor Galui alluded to this, we forget that it's a double-edged sword. It can be something that can promote peace, but it also can lead to conflict. You can have interdependence coming back to bite you. Think of Angel's famous book, you know, in the beginning of the 20th century, in which Angel predicted that the world is so interdependent we will never see conflict again. And then a decade or so later, Europe was in flames. So who holds the key in this new balance of power? Is the US still the master of the game here, the great game? Will our liberal institutions, the rules-based order, hold in this new strategic environment? One thing that's also completely absent from the discussion so far, I've spent most of my life studying Europe and working in Europe. I haven't heard any mention of Europe in this. It's almost as if the Europeans are absent. AUKUS, yeah. I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger's famous comment when asked about Europe. He said, "Who speaks for Europe? Which number do I call?" I mean, the Europeans are still not united, and we have a representative from the British embassy here. The British have left the EU, broken the solidarity in Europe. I think the UK has sent an aircraft carrier maybe to East Asia to show their willingness to stand up and support the security in this region. But last night you mentioned NATO. NATO is no longer brain dead, as Emmanuel Macron said. Now Macron is a big booster, big supporter of NATO. So I would just conclude by saying that in this very uncertain world, it's now the regional alliances that are absolutely critical. You know, NATO, there's no question now that NATO is going to be the key to keeping some kind of peace and order in Europe. And Japan and the Indo-Pacific is the key, you know, to deterring China. But will we have the public resolve? It's great to be standing here in front of two tremendous American political leaders who have their finger constantly on the pulse of American politics. We can try to pull them out. Ambassador Schieffer last night said, yes, the US is ready. We're back where we should be, ready to stand up if called upon. Vladimir Putin disagrees with you. He says the liberal democratic model is exhausted itself. We must move on from that. So how can we prove him wrong? Well, we had the metaphor of the tank column, which I think was a great metaphor. Democracies have something going for them, but we are going to have to prove Vladimir Putin wrong, I think. So that's just a challenge for my colleagues here on the panel and for all of you in the room. And I shall leave it at that. Thank you very much. Hopefully all of you have had time to think about this and you're going to be ready to ask your tough questions. So who would like to begin? I don't know if any on the panel want to respond quickly to what I had to say. I'm not sure where we are on time. I think we've got time. 10 minutes? Oh, 10 minutes. Okay, well, somebody out there in the audience, ask the first question. Who would like to step up? Yes, in the back, my colleague from SMU.
Hi. Hi. My name is Nishiki Sugawara-Beda. I'm an artist. So it's like who, maybe thinks that I'm here, but I'm interested in it. And this is, I thought this is a good moment for me to ask. So it might be a bit different from what you guys have been talking about. But as an artist, I think about all kinds of things: biology, chemistry, dance, writings, and political science. And I was listening all that the information, and I couldn't help but think about education, because it's the political science is the people science, and then people, a citizen, global citizen, but in a way it is the earth citizen. It's not all the people. We are part of the animal here. And so when you think about education, we're thinking of the little kid to K-12 to a university levels, and the knowledge that we share here, but the knowledge and the in-between knowledge and the way we think about software, hardware. And I just wanted to hear what you guys think about education.
Thank you.
In the political world.
Well, we're all educators.
I know. So that's why I thought it's maybe a
But
great place.
You're right. Having an informed citizenry is always key. So who would like to start in any of take the question?
I'll just offer a comment in that I think education policy is a national security issue. And I've often thought that if there's only one policy a country must get right, it has to be education. Because in theory, then those you educate can go off and solve whatever problems come forward. And so that's why I love being in the classroom, encouraging people to challenge their own assumptions, continuously become more informed, so that we can then hold in the political realm, our political leaders accountable for what they say and do or not do.
I would just agree. And I think I would add that the United States for a long time had this amazing public education system that was free and open to everyone. And we've got a lot to fix in that model. And it's part of the reason that we're having this polarization is the differences between the educational system and how that's playing out in the US.
I think Mori sensei said you have a challenge in educating the Japanese public about the new environment. I recall you saying that.
Not so much educating the public, but I think the public should get engaged in various issues regarding national security, particularly Taiwan, to sort of develop an understanding that the Taiwan issue is not only about Taiwan, but it's also about Japan's future and independence. So in order to have a sort of a wide and flexible view of, absorbing different points of view, I think, education is critical to have that kind of open mindset. And we have the advantage of educating people in a very open society, which allows for diverse points of view. So, and that's something that we should preserve and protect, I think. Yeah. So,
I would just drive that point home. There's one great strength where Vladimir Putin is absolutely wrong. It's the open societies where we're willing to listen to each other, make the challenges, search for the consensus. That is what makes democracies ultimately so much stronger than the closed autocratic societies. I don't know how many of you in the room here are planning to immigrate to North Korea. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. So, yes.
I had a somewhat related question, particularly for Mori Sensei. I'm Kristen McCasey from the University of Maine. One of the issues we have in the United States related to education and society is disinformation and disinformation campaigns. And I was wondering in the Japanese context and Japanese national security context, many of the political wedge issues are directly related. So war history and Article 9 and pacifism. And are there issues with disinformation and sort of social media campaigns about those issues that might make it difficult for Japan to respond and have local support in the event of some contingency? And related is how best is Japan trying to respond to possible disinformation campaigns, say from China or Russia? And if not, what do you think the best way to respond might be? Thank you.
I think that's one of the cutting edge issues that Japanese policymakers are trying to tackle with. And I think these historical issues, we do have different views within the society about how we view the issue themselves. And one of the difficult aspects of this disinformation campaign is that it exploits existing social divisions, and it's structural. So, you don't resolve the problem by doing A, B, and C, and you close the gap inside the society. So there's always a vulnerability to that. And another difficulty is, how do you know that a particular, an existing view becoming more widespread is a result of disinformation or some other variable? Are you able to sort of, tell to what extent it's foreign interference or something else? And I think there's a very big challenge to that. And I think the policymakers are grappling with this issue. And I think the US is also dealing with the same issue where you have the political polarization being exploited by other countries and so forth.
And I think artificial intelligence is going to complicate all this even more.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. So technology is going to aggravate this situation. So disinformation, tackling or dealing with disinformation is becoming increasingly difficult, I think. And I guess countries, especially in advanced democracies, will have to exchange views and come up with, good practices and identify what they think are making a workable and viable in the future. So I don't have any, how should I say, a special tactic to sort of solve this problem, but I think this is one of the very, very difficult issues. When it comes to security and society, it's about, as Hollifield Sensei said, public resolve. And if other foreign countries are able to exploit and divide the society, it's going to slow down our response. And that makes it very difficult for us to mobilize the society. And that's going to be a weakness. So
this might be democracy's Achilles heel. Yeah, Professor Galui.
So I'm going to offer a tactic. Hiroki mentioned the town I live in, Prosper, Texas. Something we're doing in Prosper, Texas, a town of 35,000 people, to address this issue is to have something we call the Prosper Exchange. Currently, it's a quarterly public forum, in person only, where we address America's most challenging issues. The first one we did was on immigration. We then did taxation. And in September, our third one will be US global leadership. And the fourth one we're thinking about is America's gun debate. And this is Collin County, Texas. We bring in people, 2 speakers who represent opposing ideas. They each present much like we did for 10 or 15 minutes. And then we have an exchange with the community. Now, I offer it as a tactic that we're trying out, but we had 40 people attend the first one, 85 the second one. We have 100 sign up for the third one. And we're just hoping that this moves forward, because our mayor bought into the idea that if we can't have honest dialogue and civil discourse in a town of 35,000 people, where we should have more in common than we do difference because we chose to live and prosper, if we can't do that, then perhaps the experiment is doomed. Yet we are unwilling to concede that fact. So that is a tactic we're trying, because to combat it at a higher level, I think we just get lost in the noise. We're trying to do something a little bit quieter, grassroots, and maybe that'd be more effective over a longer term.
A perfect example of what the great French commentator Alexis de Tocqueville said: the strength of American democracy, associational life, strong civil society. I'm curious, would you say you see the same thing in Japan? And when you look at the villages and the countryside in Japan, they seem to be depopulating. Japan is losing population. So is it losing the dynamism and do you see these kinds of discussions at the grassroots level in Japan?
I don't have any, rich information on that regard, but you're right that, depopulation is happening. So the government's trying to work to sort of reinvigorate the local cities and so forth, but we'll have to see how that works out. Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask if Takeuchi Sensei, do you have any final comments? We have one room for one more question. So would you like to, we need a microphone here. Yeah.
Well, I was struck with so many comments that you all made, but let me pick up one thing. That is, Mori Sensei said that half of the population supports the tax increase for a defense expense, and then you take it as a kind of only half, but for me it's like as much as half. And so my question is it? I think it's really like a high number. And then I got my question to my colleagues, Diana and Jason. Do you think that if you ask the American public the same question, do you agree that the federal government should increase federal tax to cover more defense budget? Do you think like half of the American public will agree with it?
So if I could start, I guess I would say it depends on the events and the circumstances on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not an economist, but I do have two arms. I think that, how it's framed would impact the answer to that question. And I think this goes back to some of Jim's commentary or critique on what I said. I don't think any of our populations particularly want to go to war, but I do think that the Biden administration is trying to learn from perhaps some of the mistakes of the Obama administration in not responding more strongly towards Crimea, and not, in saying the red line in Syria and walking away from that. And I think they're trying to create a sense of deterrence, not a path to fighting. But I think it's an important, I think the way the world responded to Ukraine surprised Putin. Ambassador Schiefer said this last night, single-handedly made NATO a unified and important alliance again. And we've added to it by, 3 nations or almost 3. So I do think that the American public, if you ask them, should we prevent China from invading Taiwan, you would get a very high popular response. I think if you said, should we increase taxes so that we can increase our defense spending, you would not get a very high response. So.
Yes, Mori Sensei, would you like to have the last word?
Yes, very quickly. I don't think the absolute number of percentages matter because it's also actually ultimately about, whether they are able to pass legislation to, actually achieve these tax increases and so forth. Secondly, these figures change from time to time. And apparently in this tax increase package, they have corporate tax increase as well. So if you're entering a wage negotiation season, people tend to think, well, if you increase tax on the corporations, then the companies will be discouraged from raising the wages. And, the members of Diet will have to worry, they have to appear to be supporting the voters, right? So they'll be opposed. So these things, change over time. And I think, what ultimately matters is when the legislation comes to the Diet and there's a voting timing, then, whether there's enough support at that point to pass those bills. And if it goes through, then yeah, we'll probably deliver. But if it doesn't, it's going to be very difficult. So that's how I could say it. Yeah.
Okay, I think we actually have run out of time. I don't know if anyone else wants to get in on this, but we'll see what the next instructions are. But could everyone join me in thanking the panelists for this? I think we will get instructions about what to do next year.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a fun time, that is lunch. So lunch box is ready outside. So please pick up lunch box and